Hello, I'm Andrew Gleeson and welcome again to The Speaking Lions, and this is the fourth video in our series on the problem of evil, part of a Thinking Out Loud collection of videos. In my videos so far I've been pretty damn critical of theodicy and of skeptical theism, and I've been so in the name of human suffering, in the name of the burning children. But I also want to do it in the name of God. This is not a God-bashing exercise, though it is certainly going to involve some bashing of certain philosophical assumptions about God and other things. So I want to make a start on moving in that direction by sketching a truer understanding of the human and religious responses to evil and to goodness, and in particular how a love of the world and a religious sense of such love can be retained, renewed, and even created and inspired without theodicy and even repudiating theodicy. So I need to begin by reminding us of the distinction between the so-called intellectual problem of evil and the existential problem of evil. Now, this is a distinction that is routinely made in analytic philosophy of religion. Just about all discussions of the problem of evil begin with this distinction or make this distinction at some stage. And the sharpness of the distinction, I'm not saying there's no distinction at all here, but the sharpness of the distinction is in general far too acute, and I'm going to need to make a video about that at some stage as well, though in the meantime you can consult my book again, Frightening Love. But here just let me recap the gist of the distinction as it's conventionally made. So on the one hand, there is a problem which is peculiar to theists, to people who believe in God, where this is understood as the omnipotent, omniscient, and all-perfect or all-loving creator of the world. How can the existence of such a being as that, be consistent with the existence of the evil that we find in the universe? That's the intellectual problem, and it has an intellectual solution. There are moral assumptions that need to be made, though, as I've tried to explain, and again this needs some further attention too, there's a strong tendency in analytic philosophy of religion to minimize the moral assumptions involved, and to deal with the problem with as thin a set of resources, of purely cognitive and intellectual resources as you can, the sort of resources that analytic philosophers specialize in. Anyway, that's the intellectual problem. The existential problem, or the personal problem, or sometimes also there's a political problem of evil. These are practical problems, which are not just problems for theists, but problems for everybody, even problems for atheists, as we'll see in a minute. The problem here is, well, there are various problems. How do I personally maintain my joy and my motivation in life, and my ability to find meaning and purpose in life, given all the evil that there is in the world? Or how do I overcome evil in my personal life, or how do I overcome evil politically? Now, these are personal and practical problems. And the philosopher has nothing, perhaps, very much directly to contribute to discussions of these kinds of questions qua philosopher. They're more problems for counsellors, pastors, psychologists, political activists, people like that. So anyway, here we have two sharply different problems. Now, so far in this video, we've been concentrating on the first problem, the intellectual problem of evil, where I've been arguing that theodicy is a pretty comprehensive failure. And skeptical theism, which is a kind of partner to theodicy, does not get us very far either. But this video is going to concentrate its attention on the what I will call the existential problem of evil. And when I say it will concentrate on the existential problem of evil, it will actually concentrate on one particular version or interpretation of the existential problem of evil, which, following those who have discussed it, I'll call the problem of optimism. And I'm going to mention here two philosophers, one in particular and another more briefly, who've both put forward in pretty much the same terms the problem of optimism. The first philosopher I want to discuss is Cameron Bertuzzi, who you probably know from the very good Christian YouTube channel, Capturing Christianity. Terrific channel. Got some great stuff on it. So, I mean, it's not the way I do philosophy, but it's a good channel. I recommend it. Cameron's a good guy. He's a greater good theodicist, supplemented with a dash of skeptical theism. In the video I'm going to show you here, it's from about a year ago, and he's giving a talk, and he discusses a version of the existential problem, which he calls the problem of evil for atheists. Okay, it's actually the existential problem of evil for everyone, but he's concerned with how can atheists deal with this problem compared to how theists can deal with it. And it's essentially the problem of how one can remain optimistic in the face of all the evil in the world. And he argues that regarding this problem, the atheist is in a much weaker position than the theist. So anyway, let's have a quick look here at what he says. Okay, here it comes.
Is there a problem of evil for atheists? I think the answer is yes. And it's probably going to be in a form that you haven't seen before. So we are optimists. Most people are optimistic about the world, including atheists. And by an optimist, I mean something very, very specific. An optimist believes the world is overall good and that we should be happy and grateful that we live in it. An optimist believes the world is overall good and that we should be happy and grateful that we live in it. Here's a quote from a famous atheist, Richard Dawkins. He says, quote, "We have cause to give thanks for our highly improbable existence and the law-like evolutionary processes that gave rise to it. Such gratitude is not owed to or to be directed towards anyone or anything." Nevertheless, he does have this sort of optimistic take on the world. Now, the question is this: how can one maintain optimism in the face of so much suffering in the world? Given the three reasons that I outlined just now, theists, or people that believe in God, are in a much better position to maintain optimism than atheists. If God exists, not only is there a loving being at the foundation of all reality, every case of suffering serves some greater purpose. But what can an atheist actually appeal to? Can they appeal to greater purposes? No. On atheism, all that exists is material reality. They got nothing. They got nothing. And so theists are in a much better position to maintain optimism than their atheist counterparts.
Okay, so I think that's pretty straightforward. I think you can get the central idea here. The theist is in a stronger position because he's got so many more and richer resources to draw on. He's got a loving Father at the foundation of all reality, an omnipotent, omniscient loving Father. So humans are pretty puny by comparison with that. So he's going to be able to do a lot more to make the world a better place. The theist can have a confidence that every case of suffering serves some greater purpose, quote unquote. Well, certainly the atheist, I don't think it's quite correct to say the atheist got nothing, as he says at one point. That's not quite true, but nevertheless, certainly by comparison with those resources, the atheist might seem to be in an inferior position. But my point, the thing I would say, is to look that we notice the similarity to the theodical way, the very strong similarity. It's almost the same thought as the theodical line of thinking that you get in the intellectual problem of evil. There's essentially a quasi, well, certainly a quantitative and almost quasi-arithmetic bent of thinking that goes on here. We've got so many resources, there's so much of them, they're so huge, we just overwhelms the puny resources of the atheist rival. Another philosopher, in this case an academic philosopher, Yujin Nagasawa, who's based in the United Kingdom, he talks about what he calls existential optimism, and he's even more expressly quantitative. He has a nice little image where he divides the world into the yellow and the grey, the yellow being the positive things in the world and the grey being the negative things in the world. And he argues, pretty much it's the same argument as Cameron gives. He argues that the theist has more resources than the atheist to deal with systemic evil. And in particular, he points to the existence of an afterlife, which, going on for all infinity, which offers really unlimited scope for addressing any deficit of yellow in the present life. So it's essentially the same idea. Okay, I'll put a reference in the notes down below to Eugen's paper on this matter and a reply to it that I've put in print. Okay, well, I'm calling this next section of the paper of the presentation against arithmetic. I think that their picture of the way in which they try as philosophers to approach the existential problem of evil is actually profoundly untrue to our actual existential responses. In reality, we don't need vast quantities of evil or vast quantities of good to determine our and to determine legitimately, I guess it's an important qualification, our existential responses to the world. A single case of a child's suffering can make the world unredeemable in someone's eyes. And no amount, just as I argued with the intellectual problem about justifying God's actions, okay, just as no amount or kinds of greater good can set all that to rights in the sense of excusing God's behaviour or his failure to behave to prevent all this. Just as it can't do that, similarly no amounts or kinds of greater good can set to right, okay, our sense of the world as a place that welcomes us, a place that we can love and be grateful for. And it seems to me that this, what we have here again is the case of I quoted in the first video of Ivan Karamazov from Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. I mean, for Ivan, even God and all his works, okay, cannot make him, that is Ivan, willing to accept the world, even if it convinces everyone else. And there's a remarkable passage, I quoted it in my book, and I'll quote it to you again now. It's worth discussing. This is from the brothers Karamazov, and Ivor is speaking to his brother Aloysia. I accept God, and am glad to, and what's more, I accept his wisdom, his purpose, which are utterly beyond our ken. I believe in the underlying order and the meaning of life. I believe in the eternal harmony in which they say we shall one day be blended. I believe in the word to which the universe is striving, in which itself was with God, in which itself is God, and so on to infinity. Yet, would you believe it? In the final result, I don't accept this world of God's. And although I know it exists, I don't accept it at all. It's not that I don't accept God, you must understand. It's the world created by him I don't and cannot accept. Let me make it plain. I believe like a child that suffering will be healed and made up for, that all the humiliating absurdity of human contradictions will vanish like a pitiful mirage, that in the world's finale, at the moment of eternal harmony, something so precious will come to pass that it will suffice for all our hearts, for the comforting of all resentments, for the atonement of all the crimes of humanity, of all the blood they've shed, that it will make it not only possible to forgive, but to justify all that has happened with men. But though all that may come to pass, I don't accept it, I won't accept it. Well, the thing that's, to me, really striking about this passage is almost its contradictory nature. I mean, for most of the passage, he seems to have accepted the whole theodical story. He endorses it. He expressly says, he grants all its factual claims, about how wonderful everything's going to be, especially in the life hereafter. We're all going to be reconciled to one another, etc., etc., etc. He even grants the moral point of theodicy, in the intellectual problem of evil. That all of these things that will come to pass will make it not only possible to forgive, but to justify all that has happened with men. And presumably, I take it in the context to mean will justify God's apparent action or inaction. And yet, and this enables him to actually go deeper, because having granted all of that, he still insists that this is no good, maybe not even to the point, as far as the existential problem of evil goes. So he's granting for the sake of argument as well, more for the sake of argument, that something I would, as you know from my first 3 videos, I would not grant, namely that the arguments, the greater goods of theodicists can provide an excuse for the God of the philosophers. But even if we, I would not grant that, but he seems willing to, even confesses his belief in it. But it doesn't make the world a more welcoming place to him. It doesn't make it something for which he feels gratitude. And what I think maybe he's getting at here, what we can learn from this, is that our response to the world is not narrowly one of moral judgment. In the intellectual problem of evil, we focus on this agent, who's really there'll be another video about this, an inflated version of a human being, made strangely invisible and other things. But essentially, a moral agent like us, subject to, answerable to the same set of moral rules and principles as they apply to his more elevated circumstances. Just the way you would apply them to a king, a monarch who's in more elevated circumstances and has more power than the ordinary Joe and so forth. But I think Dostoevsky, through his character here, Ivan, is saying that the issues here in our existential response are involve much more than the sort of considerations that go into moral judgment. Just as you can love a child whose behaviour is vicious and still love them as your child, so you can love the world. Similarly, you can hate people whose lives are overall good, maybe because of one terrible thing they've done. And these attitudes are not necessarily to be condemned as irrational. You may have been justified in that terrible deed or in that terrible deed. taking some innocent lives to save it. Perhaps that's justified, perhaps that's defensible. But for Ivan, it leaves the world an uninhabitable place to him. And those attitudes are, I think he's right to think those attitudes are consistent. Philosophers oversimplify. I mean, it's more complicated than I'm saying as well here too. I'm only scratching the surface, but philosophers in general, it seems to me, treat these kinds of matters far too simply. I mean, if things were a matter of arithmetic, then the pessimist, I think, would likely win hands down for most human lives even today. I mean, that's admittedly from the atheist, without maybe the resources of the Christian to suppose that an infinite bliss after death. Not, of course, that Christianity has always supposed that it's just going to be an infinite bliss after death. But anyway, we won't go into that. I'm told that there is an ethnic group in North Africa who had the practice whereby each day, at the end of the day, you would, they had some white and black beads, and at the end of each day, you would put either a white bead or a black bead into a bowl, according as you'd had a happy day or an unhappy day. And then in your deathbed, you'd count up the number of white beads, the number of black beads, and you'd know whether you had a happy life or an unhappy life on balance. Well, given the circumstances of whether a person's life or unhappy life, a lot depends on a person's attitude. But nevertheless, in material terms, there would, on the face of it, the case for antinatalism would look irrefutable, I think. And yet, Jordan Peterson was closer to the truth when he said about antinatalism that however right it may be on the facts, however much that bowl may be full on your deathbed of black beads, nevertheless, the problem with antinatalism is that it remains a cowardly philosophy. What we want in life is not primarily lack of danger and suffering. It's not to make light of those things, far from it. But much less do we want just comfort and contentment, as if we were cows or sheep. But what we want most of all is meaning. And people will endure and suffer until death for an inspiring meaning. And meaning is not a quantitative phenomenon. Just as an encounter with one case of grey may leave a person's life with only an inconsolable sorrow, so that all the yellow pales into grey, the reverse can also be the case with just a spot of yellow. The smallest thing in a quantitative sense may be great with meaning. Consider, for example, this humble act of goodness, physically so little, just a few words, short conversation. And yet, it transformed a person's understanding of the world. It's described here by Ruth Kluger in her memoir, Still Alive, a Holocaust Girlhood Remembered. So the situation is, he was 13 years old, and as you know, when the Jews arrived by train to the camps, there would be some thug capo who was assigned the responsibility to decide who was going straight to the gas chambers and who, would be judged as strong enough or had some skill or ability that could be useful, that could keep them alive for a while longer. And Ruth was just 13 years old, just a child, and she looked doomed to go straight to the gas chambers. But there was a young woman, didn't know her, never met before. I don't think they saw one another again, because I think this other young woman did go straight to the gas chamber. This woman intervened and argued with the guard and said, "Look, this girl. Look, she's young, she's strong, she's got talent. She can be of use to you. She can help you. She can do work. She can work. Let her, take me." And she persuaded the guard to let Ruth live, and Ruth ended up surviving the camps. And as I say, I don't think she ever saw that woman again, for the obvious reason. But this is how, many, many years later, Ruth looked back on that experience. I'm reading here from her book. It was an act of the kind that is always unique, no matter how often it occurs. An incomprehensible act of grace, or put more modestly, a good deed. Yet the first term, an act of grace, is perhaps closer to the truth, although the agent was human and the term is religious. So if I don't know whether Kluger is religious or not. For it came out of the blue sky and was undeserved and was as undeserved as if its originator had been up in the clouds. I was saved by a young woman who was in as helpless a situation as the rest of us, and who nonetheless wanted nothing other than to help me. The more I think about the scene, the more astonished I am about its essence. About someone making a free decision to save another person in a place which promoted the instinct of self-preservation to the point of crime and beyond. It was both unrivaled and exemplary. Neither psychology nor biology explains it. The good is incomparable and inexplicable because it doesn't have a proper cause outside itself and because it doesn't reach for anything beyond itself. If a prisoner passed on the beatings he received to those even more helpless than he was merely reacting as psychology and biology would expect him to. But if he did the reverse? And so one might argue that in the perverse environment of Auschwitz, absolute goodness was a possibility. It's as if she's saying it was a possibility only when it was an impossible, had the appearance at least of an impossibility. In more benign circumstances, it wouldn't have the absolute quality it had in those circumstances. Anyway, absolute goodness was a possibility, like a leap of faith, beyond the humdrum chain of cause and effect. I don't know how often it was consummated. Surely not often. Surely not only in my own case. But it existed. I am a witness. Well, I would not dare say that this experience made her an optimist. In fact, I'm sure it didn't. But that just shows that optimism is not an adequate concept to deal with these matters. Optimism and pessimism are empirical estimations of the likely course of events. And to that, quantitative evidence certainly is relevant. But it is not relevant here because something else is going on. Now, I know that Cameron, we saw, has his own stipulative definition of optimism, as, in his words, believing the world is overall good and therefore we should be happy and grateful to live in this world. But of course, this definition rests on believing the world is overall good, and that's the quantitative theodical assumption about how the course of events will go in the long run. So in the end, his definition depends on mine. The difference is that in my account of matters I'm about to give, there is no empirical assumption and no justification, as opposed to inspiration, for the gratitude. What Ruth was witness to that day had no effect at all on her empirical expectations of how the world would go, whether it would go more or less agreeably for her. The effect it did have is apparent less in what she explicitly says than in her tone, her spirit. That tone is not mere optimism, and in fact it's compatible with severe pessimism. In a way it's not compatible with bitterness or misanthropy. It is more too than mere animal relief at surviving. It's more like a gratitude, not just to this young woman for her act, but for the world that could contain such incomparable and inexplicable goodness. Sometimes a splash of yellow is enough, even in an ocean of grey, in an ocean of black. None of this is to suggest that anything goes in such matters. You can just think anything at all in any circumstances. If Ivan Karamazov is melodramatic or self-pitying, he will be open to criticism, as will people like Ruth if what they write is cloistered or Pollyanna-ish. And both must respect facts and logic. But I think there are people, I'm just going to assert this here, that there are people who are not at fault in any of these scores, and yet who find that they cannot be grateful for life given the evils it contains, or that they have witnessed. Just as there are also people equally not at fault who cannot but be grateful for life despite these evils. You may find one of these attitudes incomprehensible and the other inescapable, and you will have a strong case behind you, but it is not the case of a universal rationality per se. I probably will return to this in some future work. But to reiterate the main point in this video, the matter is not settled by arithmetic, by counting up the amounts of grey and yellow. There is nothing specially privileged about the quantitative perspective. If anything, it's an attempt to evade the issue, to camouflage the real existential response which each of us has under a spurious cloak of impersonality and objectivity. An individual existential response is not a scientific summation, but a gestalt perception, a perspective, a take, not on numbers, but on what matters, what is important. Trying to settle the goodness of God and or the world by counting numbers is, well, in the theodical case, in the intellectual problem case, it's settling a moral question by counting votes. Okay. Now, the existential problem of evil, as I've been arguing, is much more than a moral issue. But it's analogous, but in an analogous way, it's not settlable by arithmetic, by counting votes. As I say, a single case can be enough. When a personal response is lucid and intelligent, and is a lucid and intelligent expression of integrity, it can carry real authority here in matters such as these. Well, the curious arithmetic of theodicy is strange enough, I've argued, or dubious enough, I've argued in the previous videos. But the idea that a single act may redeem the universe may seem stranger still, a stranger anti-arithmetic. And yet the religions of the world seem to agree. How can it be, as the Quranic saying has it, that if anyone saves a life, it shall be as though he had saved the lives of all mankind? Well, I don't know how that can be, but the idea of one good, loving act or life redeeming the whole world is, we should remember, perhaps the central Christian doctrine, the atonement. Some have suggested that because the crucified man was God, and God is infinitely good, the murder of God can outweigh all the evil. Well, this is an attempt to re-insinuate the notion of a quantitative superiority into the atonement, and it's an attempt to force that notion where it will not go. We should remember that infinity is not a number, and in a religious context, a word like infinite takes on a very different sense from that which it has in mathematics, or perhaps it takes on a sense from the mystical dimension of maths. At any rate, it is a context where the metaphor of outweighing loses any enlightenment it might have once had. This kind of forcing of the quantitative into radically non-quantitative context is a persistent tic of the human mind. It appears again and again in philosophy of religion and the problem of evil in particular, such as the attraction of a certain rationalist ideal of clarity. And one of the sort of meta-philosophical themes running behind all my videos and all my work is an implied critique of that rationalist ideal. Anyway, okay, that's it. That's the whole story. Notes below with references to some of where you can find Cameron's video and Yujin's paper and Ruth Kluger's book. Okay. Hope I'll have some more work for you soon. Okay. Have a good one.